Hi, everybody. The title of this lecture is called The Enigma of Andrew Wyeth. W. Barksdale Maynard is a professional writer and journalist. He lectures on art and architecture at several universities. One of the most prolific local art authors, he has written 8 historical books since 2002, several of them being award-winning. Biographies of Thoreau at Walden Pond, Woodrow Wilson at Princeton University, and an unauthorized biography of Andrew Wyeth at Chadsford. His book, Artists of the Wyeth Country, Howard Pyle, N.C. Wyeth, and Andrew Wyeth, tells how Andrew became one of the most popular painters in our country. Mr. Maynard will share his insights and interviews with people who knew Andrew, as well as several of his paintings and his unusual style and subjects. He will also include a guidebook to all the places that Andrew painted. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? My subject is the book, Artists of Wyeth Country, Howard Pyle, N.C. Wyeth, and Andrew Wyeth. Did you hear in the introduction that I wrote a previous book about one of your parishioners, Woodrow Wilson? And you might enjoy this book as well. Woodrow Wilson, of course, lived in Bryn, Mawr, taught there, had strong feelings about women and women's education, and he went on to Princeton and the presidency. The Wyeth book, I think, comes out of my love of nature. As a kid in Alabama, that's the Maynard family station wagon there. As a kid growing up in Alabama, we went hiking, we went camping. I absolutely loved it. Backpacks were extremely heavy back in the 1970s. I just loved being outdoors. And I think that the Wyeth book really comes out of that, because what this book is basically about is the Wyeth family's love of nature. I also wrote a book about Walden Pond and Henry David Thoreau. And there's a close connection here, an extraordinary connection actually, between the Wyeth family and Henry David Thoreau. If you remember, Henry David Thoreau spent 2 years living beside a pond in Massachusetts. And N.C. Wyeth grew up not far from that very pond in Massachusetts. And in fact, N.C. Wyeth painted this picture of Henry David Thoreau beside the pond. Henry David Thoreau becomes really an almost religious figure in the mind of N.C. Wyeth. N.C. Wyeth was not a religious man, but if he had any religion, it was Thoreau and nature worship. And I think to understand Wyeth art, you've got to understand this Thoreauvian connection. N.C. Wyeth had a big family. 3 of his kids became painters. When the youngest child was born, the little boy there in the front, N.C. Wyeth was thrilled that Andy was born 100 years to the day after Henry David Thoreau. So this connection between Andrew Wyeth and Thoreau goes back literally to his birth. Now, my book is an unauthorized biography of Andrew Wyeth, as the headline there explains. And I think this is an extremely important point. For you as the reader, you're delving into an unauthorized account. And I think that's good for the reader, because I think you can expect to find new information, new interpretations, new questions being asked, maybe questions that no one thought to ask previously. Now, I will say, as the biographer, this is a hard way to go about writing a book when you are unauthorized. The authorized biographer gets the red carpet treatment and every door is flung open. The unauthorized biographer is a bit like the skunk at the Presbyterian garden party. It is tough. Occasionally, the unauthorized biographer wonders, why am I doing this? This is so hard. But I think the answer is, it's good for the reader. They're exciting new things. that come out of unauthorized, new, fresh interpretations. Now, I call Andrew Wyeth the enigmatic painter. Why is that? Enigmatic. He doesn't seem that enigmatic. He's so down to earth. He's so folksy. He's so friendly and so garrulous. And he paints rather ordinary things, doesn't he? Barns and cows. How can he be an enigma? Well, let me tell you, he is deeply enigmatic, deeply mysterious, fascinating, strange, just hard to grasp for such a seemingly ordinary person. Let me try to show you this by comparing Andrew Wyeth to another artist, a more typical artist. And you'll see how different Andrew Wyeth is from the ordinary. And I pick here, almost at random, Stephen Green, because I knew Stephen Green a little bit, and because Stephen Green was born exactly in the same summer as Andrew Wyeth. So they're exact contemporaries. And Stephen Green is kind of typical as an American artist. He goes to art school. Andrew Wyeth never did. Stephen Green goes around Europe. He goes to every museum in Europe. Andrew Wyeth never did. Stephen Green paints for 52 years. For only 2 years is he able to support himself. Otherwise, he's got to take a university job. So Stephen Green teaches in universities. Andrew Wyeth never. Andrew Wyeth becomes incredibly rich as a painter, a thing that Stephen Green could never have dreamed of. Stephen Green lectures to public audiences. He travels the country, talking at museums, talking to clubs. Andrew Wyeth never, never. Stephen Green's art evolves over time. He's a social realist here in the 1940s, but then by the 1960s, 70s, he's an abstract painter. Andrew Wyeth's art does not evolve. It's fixed. It's really the same style for about 70 years of painting. Also, I think very atypical with Andrew Wyeth, Stephen Green has what you might call subject matter. Stephen Green sometimes has a social conscience in his painting. Sometimes he's talking about an historical event. Here, he's clearly referring to the crucifixion. So sometimes he's got a religious topicality. Andrew Wyeth, I would argue, almost never. Almost never. You don't see social realism. You don't see history painting. You don't see religion. Andrew Wyeth's art is intensely private. It's about himself. It's about his friends, his personal connections. But these bigger themes are, and I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but they're virtually absent. I've looked hard, for example, to find religious subject matter in Andrew Wyeth, because people respond to Andrew Wyeth's paintings with such spiritual intensity. If you saw the Philadelphia Museum show, the retrospective of Andrew Wyeth's art, people burst into tears regularly looking at his paintings. Is it religious? The painting Spring Fed. Now here I thought maybe there's a religious undertone here, because if you've looked at religious art from the German or the Northern Renaissance, Christ is born in the manger. That's not a manger, but it's a drinking slab, a drinking trough. And then often in those paintings, the manger, the shed is very rickety, and you look through the kind of broken, rickety windows of the shed, and there are cows looking in to witness the birth of Christ. And there's often a hill rising in the distance, which might be the hill of Calvary. So could there be some religious theme here? There are the cows. No, Andrew Wyeth himself said to his sister, you know what that painting's about? You know what that trough is about? It's about death. Death. And in fact, studying Andrew Wyeth for 3 years, I see that he really was not a religious man in any sense whatsoever, except for a kind of pantheism, a Thoreauvian nature worship. Now, my book is partly a biography of this highly enigmatic, different person, but it's also a guidebook. And the idea is you can get this book and go down to Chadsford and drive around and walk around and you'll see the places that Andrew Wyeth painted. And it's the first time you've been able to do that. You open the book, you look at the maps, and there you are in the world of Andrew Wyeth, standing where he stood. Because if he is this great painter of nature, then we've got to know, where did he go? Where did he stand? What did he see? What is it he's responding to in the world of nature? This book makes this possible for the first time. But buy the book in Philadelphia. Don't try to buy it at the Brandywine River Museum of Art. It is not for sale at the Brandywine River Museum of Art. The book has photographs, and I'm really proud of these. They're aerial photographs, never reproduced before, that showed Chadds Ford in the 1920s and 30s. So you're seeing exactly the world of Andrew Wyeth as it was then. And the numbers indicate places that he painted. For example, this is Kerner Farm. And down there at the lower right, number 5, that's the Kerner house, Kerner barn, as it was when Andy Wyeth started to paint there. It's like time travel, really, to study these photographs. Now, what is Chadds Ford? If Andrew Wyeth is enigmatic, I think Chadds Ford is enigmatic. It's a strange place. It's suburban, but kind of rural at the same time. It's connected to Philadelphia, but barely, because as you see on the map, it's at the far outer reaches of the Philadelphia cultural world. And it's connected to Delaware, which is down there at the bottom. Actually, I think more than to Philadelphia, but that's never really talked about. In interviewing people who knew Andrew Wyeth, I was constantly struck by the diversity of people who knew him in Chadds Ford. And these people ranged from the people who mowed his grass, to the people who repaired his car, to DuPont executives, neurosurgeons, the whole span of American society seems to exist side by side in Chadds Ford. This fascinating and strange place. Come visit and you'll see what I mean. Now, what do you know about Andrew Wyeth? You heard an excellent talk about him a few weeks ago. You're probably pretty up to date, but let me just remind you, people will say to me, oh yeah, I know that guy, he painted the girl on the hillside. And they'll sometimes say, I'll show you in Chadds Ford where he painted that. I drive by that hill every day. Well, that of course is completely false. He painted Christina's World in Maine, not Chadds Ford. But there is a Chadds Ford connection to Christina's World. Andrew Wyeth said, if I had never seen that dead crow on the hillside, I would never have painted Christina's World. So he painted the dead crow on the left there in Chadds Ford, and then he went up to Maine, and there's Christina. Isn't that remarkable? But my book is not about Maine. And this may be one of the very first Andrew Wyeth books to focus entirely on Chadds Ford. Chadds Ford is where he was born. It's where he spent most of his life, every winter, and it's where he died. It's profoundly important to understand what he was doing in Chadds Ford. It's in Chadds Ford that he paints Groundhog Day, one of the great glories of the Philadelphia Museum. He's in the Kerner kitchen. It's in the 1950s. He looks out the window, he sees a huge log that the farmer, Carl Kerner, has cut. And in fact, he imagines that Carl Kerner is going to come back any minute and have breakfast at the table right there. That's Carl Kerner's place setting. You know it's Carl Kerner because he stabs everything with a knife. He wouldn't deign to use an effete fork, always a knife. And this is a very typical Andrew Wyeth painting, isn't it? It's about absence, it's about loneliness, it's about Wyeth's personal connection to this other human being, Carl Kerner. And when you come down with your guidebook that you've bought up in Philadelphia, you can go around and you can take a tour of the Kerner farm, and you can see all these places for yourself today. They're beautifully preserved. And you can look out the window where he stood 60 years ago and see the same sight that he saw. And you can judge for yourself, how accurately does Andrew Wyeth paint what he sees? My conclusion in this book, he paints with extraordinary accuracy, extreme accuracy. And this has not really been noticed by previous writers. I tell every audience, Andrew Wyeth used to be very famous. And this is important too. He was on the cover of Time magazine. When's the last time an oil painter was on the cover of Time magazine? Will an oil painter ever again be on the cover of Time magazine? But he represents this cultural moment where art, the whole tradition since the Renaissance, was really important to ordinary Americans in the middle of the 20th century. And he was very famous. So famous, he's invited repeatedly to the White House. He seems to be the favorite of every president. Here he is in the East Room at the White House with Pat Nixon in 1970. Wyeth looks happy here, doesn't he? But I think, in fact, he was deeply unhappy. He did not like this kind of public event. He did not like all those eyes staring at him. He looks kind of like a nervous teenage boy in those odd clothes that his wife Betsy designed for him, so he would look suitably artistic. Interestingly, this is the same year he strikes up the relationship with Helga Testorf, his model, the subject of the Helga pictures. And I think it's just as he becomes really famous in the 1960s that he backs away from that and he seeks this even more private relationship with this local person in Chadds Ford, and they wander off into the hills alone to escape this glare of attention. But nonetheless, he's invited back to the White House late in life by President George W. Bush to receive a major medal, an important honor. As the photographs are being taken, Andrew Wyeth turns to President Bush and says, "Mr. President, you and I have a lot in common." And President Bush says, "What do you mean we have a lot in common? I'm the president. What do we have in common?" And Andrew Wyeth says, "Everybody hates us." And what he meant was the critics didn't like Andrew Wyeth. They never did. They never liked him. And he endures lots of critical abuse, even as the general public adored Andrew Wyeth's painting. The general public saw these paintings very largely in the books that Andy's wife, Betsy, produced. If you were around in the 1970s, you will remember that Wyeth at Kerner's was on every coffee table in America. This book was everywhere, and it's a beautiful book. It remains a real masterpiece of book production. Just as Wyeth was beginning to fade from the headlines in the 80s, suddenly he comes back in this big way because he had a stunning secret. All those pictures of Helga Testorf. This was a married Chadds Ford housewife, and Andrew Wyeth had been painting her secretly for 15 years. And suddenly the paintings are revealed to the world, and even his wife didn't know that all this was going on. It seems almost inconceivable that in a village like Chadds Ford, and I do mean it is a tiny village, that his wife didn't notice this for 15 years. But Andrew Wyeth was exceedingly secretive. And I think his wife became rather a hermit. And so maybe she didn't know that this was happening. When Andrew Wyeth died, the critics pounced again. The obituary in the New York Times. And I have to say, this does seem rather upsetting that in writing an obituary for one of the great artists of the 20th century, that the New York Times should have gone in for some abuse of his painting abilities. They said a strangely circumscribed life has produced a sadly circumscribed art. And I really thought about that when I started this book. There is a circumscribed quality to Andrew Wyeth's work, definitely. I mean, he never goes anywhere. He just paints in Chadds Ford within a 2-mile radius over and over for 70 years. How do you explain that? You've got to explain that. We have got to explain that. Whether you love his work or don't like his work, you've got to explain, why is it so narrow? I have a theory, and it's because, according to my theory, he would only paint what he could see in the course of a daily walk, like Henry David Thoreau. This was his artistic method. He would get up in the morning. He wouldn't tell Betsy where he was going. He would go out the door and he would go walking. And he would see something in the course of the walk, and that would inspire his painting. And that's why his art is circumscribed, because he's walking, like Henry David Thoreau, he's walking. The famous painting Trodden Weed that you see here, and he's marching down a Chad's Ford hillside. He's wearing the old studio prop boots that had belonged to Howard Pyle. I think this summarizes what his art is about, really. The experience of walking, you merge into nature in this Thoreauvian way. You disappear, the person disappears, and nature becomes everything. So we don't see the artist's face or hands or anything. The artist is merging into nature itself. And I've got a lot of photographs in the book that have never been reproduced before that show Andrew Wyeth going out walking in Chad's Ford. So here he is. He's just gotten out of his old station wagon. That's probably his sketchbook under his arm. And he's got his old boots on and his jeans. And he's going to go out and walk the hills of Chad's Ford. That's how Andrew Wyeth worked. There he is in the 1950s at Kerner Farm, going up the hill. Now notice the dog. His only companion was his dog. He wouldn't let anybody else come along. Exactly like Henry David Thoreau, he had to be alone. This process, this artistic process, only worked if he were entirely alone. The dog is actually useful to us because Andy Wyeth would sit on the ground and he would sketch and he would throw the pictures aside, and then the dog would walk all over them with muddy footprints. And so curators can date Andrew Wyeth's artwork by the size of the paw prints left on the pictures, because he had different sized dogs at different times. Now, again, Kerner Farm, a couple of other things to notice. Notice the telephone poles. Everyone says Andrew Wyeth paints his world. And I say, okay, but very selectively, he leaves out those telephone poles. You're not going to see those in those Kerner Farm paintings. And notice too how really quite open the landscape was, very agricultural in the 1950s. And I'll show you the same place today. And notice what's happened to the forests. They've really grown up. They've really filled in. And this is why I think my book maybe is going to be useful, because my book shows you what Chad's Ford was like 60, 70 years ago when it was still agricultural. Chad's Ford today is suburban and it's reforested. In fact, it hardly resembles what Andrew Wyeth actually saw. So come down, use the book. There's one of the maps. The maps take you around, and these maps are really detailed. I worked hard to get these just right. For example, they show the forests as they were in 1940. And then the little gray houses, that's everything that's been built since 1940. And you come down and you'll say, wow, this has really changed. It's really changed here. It's not the world that Andrew Wyeth actually saw. He had a bad hip. And so increasingly, he would not walk, but rather drive in one of his many trucks around Chad's Ford. And he would use these trucks as a kind of mobile painting studio. And he would sit in the truck on a cold day. Or sometimes he would sit on the hood of the truck with the truck running. And somebody pulled up one time and said, hey, buddy, did your car break down? And he said, no, I'm just sitting on the hood to warm my buns. And he was painting. He would sit up there and paint. What a man. I talked to a lot of people who knew him. And that was my approach with this unauthorized book. Talk to as many people as I could who knew him personally, who could tell me what he was really like. And some people would talk, even to an unauthorized biographer. Some people would talk. And I thought this was important because look, how many people are going to be alive in 10 years who knew him well? Not many. Now is the time to talk to these people. And every person I interviewed, I asked them, has anybody ever interviewed you before? They all, virtually all said, no, I've never been interviewed. Isn't that amazing? So I think if this book has any value at all, it might be in these interviews and in preserving some of these memories. But one of the things that everyone seemed to remember was what a bad driver Andrew Wyeth was. Those stories happened over and over again. One would say, well, he would come up the hill behind my house and he'd try to squeeze between those two trees, and he never could learn that his truck wouldn't fit between those two trees. And another person said, we all loved Andy, and I didn't mind when he drove his truck down the side yard of my house through the grass, but I hated it when he would try to cut under the laundry line in his truck. Oh, he's got his dog under his arm there, in case you're wondering. That's what he's carrying. That spooky painting of Carl Kerner dying, it's called Spring. Carl Kerner had cancer in the early 70s. Here he is depicted as if he is in a snowbank melting away. Kerner Hill in the background. There's a sliver of moon there, straight out of a Howard Pyle drawing. But notice the tracks of the truck on the hillside. That's Andy's truck, no question. That's Andy's truck. Because the joke was with the Kerner family was that Andy would drive his truck all over the Kerner farm like he owned the place, and he could never seem to keep it out of the mud. He could never seem to remember where the places were that Carl really didn't want him to drive. And so those big tracks, I think, have to be a kind of ironic commentary on his relationship, his long, affectionate relationship with Carl Kerner. When Andy Wyeth, as a young man, applies for membership in the National Academy of Design, or actually, I guess he had been elected, and you had to send a painting of yourself. What does he send? He sends a painting of himself walking down Kerner Hill. I can show you where this was painted. And he's got his sketchbook tucked under his arm. So again, this is my thesis, that he's the walking painter. That's what I call him, the walking painter. And his whole art is built around walking. You see this in a series of letters he wrote to one of his patrons in Wilmington, Delaware. Wouldn't you love to receive a letter like this on his Chadsford stationery? And he says, hey, I just was thinking about you. And by the way, here's a chestnut stump that I passed the other day as I was walking. And he sketches it in the most gorgeous watercolor sketch. Those of us who are painters or try to be painters, you just eat your heart out at this watercolor. And he just dashes it off in a letter to a friend. But it's really interesting what he says. He says, I wish I had the hands to put all of this down. And this is a theme with Wyeth over and over again. He wishes he had more talent. He wishes he had the hands, the ability with the brush to capture nature accurately. And all his life, he berates himself. I'm not good enough. I'm not a good enough painter. Now, you or I would look at that and say, oh my gosh, that is so good. But he needed to be better and better and better. Why? Because he's like Thoreau. It's not about the art. It's about nature. Nature is almost godlike. And he wants to portray nature with extreme fidelity. That's his goal. He would go for a walk. He would see something. And it would give him what he called a flash impression. It's like a thunderclap. He sees something, and that's what he's going to paint. And he rushes back to the studio and he paints it. You can see this with this little watercolor at the Delaware Art Museum. Now, clearly, he's come upon this tremendous sycamore tree. I can show you where this was painted too. It's right behind Hank's restaurant in Chadsford. But he sees the shadow of that limb on the trunk. And often I think these flash impressions concern shadows. And he races back to paint it. Here, the flash impression is the raking light across the young bull at Kerner Farm. Such a famous painting. Now notice in this Kerner Farm painting, he leaves out the telephone poles, but he does include the TV antenna on the house. And I find this extremely intriguing. He hates everything modern, and he just leaves modern stuff out left and right. And yet he has some affection for Karl Kerner's TV antenna. And he shows that in many, many paintings. And I have to say, I like that. I like that he puts in that TV antenna. But did you know, if you read the literature on Karl Kerner in the authorized biographies, Karl Kerner is always portrayed as this mean, flinty, rather horrid man who struggled and was impoverished. But you know what? Karl Kerner was actually quite pleasant. When people knocked on the door, you know, young people would show up, kids out of art school, they'd show up, they'd knock on the door and they'd say, hey, I love Andrew Wyeth. Can I see Kerner Farm? Karl Kerner would bring them in, walk them upstairs, friendly. And the thing we forget too is that Karl Kerner had the most fabulous farming equipment by the 1960s and 70s. He had first-class tractors and mowers, and I don't know any of the terminology, but Karl Kerner, if it was the newest farm implement, Karl Kerner had it. Do we see that in Andrew Wyeth's paintings? Never. So does Andrew Wyeth paint his world? Not exactly. He paints what he wants to see, which is the world of the past. I call him a great anti-modernist. He's taking you back into a past that no longer exists. Kerner Farm today, the stomping grounds of Andrew Wyeth from the 1930s, gosh, to the 80s at least. That famous picture called Brown Swiss. Now we know a lot about the flash impression here because Andrew Wyeth would tell this story again and again. Andrew Wyeth was a tremendous storyteller. The observant biographer will notice that he never told the story the same way twice. It always is a little different. But basically the idea here is this afternoon, he's coming over the top of Kerner Hill. He sees the afternoon light hitting the Kerner farmhouse, hitting the cattle pond. That name Brown Swiss refers to the type of cattle. And the reflection of the house in the pond, that's the flash impression. That's like a thunderclap. And he races back and he paints this picture. So that's a good example of this flash impression approach. Brown Swiss, and let me tell you, Brown Swiss was a very, very famous painting. Did you ever watch The Partridge Family? Look in the background. Look over Danny's shoulder there on the left. That's Brown Swiss on the wall of the Partridge Family house with Susan Day and David Cassidy and Danny Bonaducci. This was a famous painting. Andrew Wyeth was everywhere, inescapable in the 60s and 70s. And yet he has nothing to do with the 60s. This is what's so enigmatic. Look at Andrew Wyeth's painting called Tennant Farmer, there at the lower left, the old farmhouse at Chad's Ford with the deer hung up in the tree. That's 1961. You'd never dreamed that was 1961. Andrew Wyeth's art has nothing to do with 1961. It doesn't have the high key color of television and Technicolor movies, Life magazine. The color is gone. It doesn't have any modern themes, technology, progress, consumerism, none of that. It's anti-modern, isn't it? Anti-modern. It's the antithesis of modernity. That's what he's about, an antithesis. All these are paintings of 1961. Andrew Wyeth's is the odd painting out. Clifford Still on the left, Tom Wesselman in the middle, a young Andy Warhol on the right, 1961. Andrew Wyeth does not belong to modern times. I call him the artist of the absolutely accurate because that's what he's after, the portrayal of nature, timeless nature, not nature of the 1960s or whatever, no, timeless, eternal nature. And he wants to portray it accurately. This is an early drawing, I think 1930s. Look how accurate this is, almost painfully realistic. He wants to paint a turkey buzzard. He's not going to imagine a turkey buzzard. He has Carl Kerner kill him a turkey buzzard. And he hangs the turkey buzzard up in his studio. This is a very, very young Andrew Wyeth, by the way. He's just gotten married, he's just starting out. And that painting ends up on the cover of American Artist magazine. In fact, that painting, Soaring, that results from these drawings, that was a US postage stamp in 2017, Chadsford painting. Accuracy. Not only are the feathers accurate of this turkey buzzard, but the landscape is accurate too. Now, people have written in the past, no, this is an imaginary landscape. No, he's made this up. Nope, this is like a map of Chadsford. I could show you that house. Come down this afternoon, I'll take you to that house. Even the driveway in that house is accurate. It's precise. Absolute accuracy. So he paints spring flowers, he paints corn cobs, and you have to think, why does he do this? Why does he do this? Now, I'm going beyond the idea that we love this. We love this. We love this. We love his art. But why does he paint like this? Because there are lots of ways to paint. And frankly, this is a really weird way to paint in the 20th century. Why do you have to be this accurate with a corn cob? I mean, who cares about a corn cob? Why does it, why? Why would you spend your time? Let's say you are the most talented wielder of the brush practically in the 20th century, and this guy's technical ability is dumbfounding. Would you paint a corn cob? We've got to understand, why does he do this? To paint a sycamore tree for a magazine cover in the 1940s, and he did do illustration work, by the way. No one seems to remember this, but he was an illustrator in the 1940s. He climbs up in the tree. He's got to be up in the tree. He's not going to imagine the tree. He's got to see the tree. It's got to be real. And I talked to the kid who held the ladder that Andrew Wyeth climbed to get up into the tree. And you can see this tree today. It's at Lafayette's headquarters in Chadsford. It's an enormous sycamore tree. It's about 400 or 500 years old. N.C. Wyeth loved this tree. Andrew Wyeth loved this tree. And he shows the sycamore tree in that very famous painting called Pennsylvania Landscape, painted during the Second World War. I could talk a lot about Pennsylvania Landscape. It's extremely important as one of his early works. It really defines his distinctive style. But just look at the tree. So if I'm right, and he's all about accuracy, I should be able to prove this to you. I should be able to prove it. So there's a tree. Look at the drawing. If you compare this drawing, and by the way, this drawing is frighteningly accurate down to the individual leaves. If we compare the drawing to the painting, they are exactly the same. There's no artistic license. There's no process here that the typical 20th century artist would go through of sort of evolving the painting. Like the drawings are a little different from nature, and then the painting is a little different from the drawings. Now that doesn't happen. Nature is the drawing is the painting. The only difference is the leaves have fallen off because it's a few weeks later. So accuracy dictates. He shows the leaves have all dropped off. You can go to the Chadsford today, study this tree, study the painting. The pattern of the limbs is identical. Tree's a little bit bigger now. Why does he paint like this? Who's going to know that he's cheated or not cheated? Who's going to know? Who's going to say to him, hey, Mr. Wyeth, I see that you've added a couple of branches where there aren't really branches. No one would catch him. There's some internal compulsion that drives him to try to be accurate. You see this with Tennant Farmer. Again, a fascinating painting. This house still survives. So we can go to this house and try to figure out how accurate is it. Now, here's what's not accurate. I found photographs taken of the house right at the same time, but these photographs show that Andrew Wyeth has left out modernity. He's left out the modern highway. He's left out the champion spark plug sign. He's left out the telephone wires, the telephone poles. He's left out the electrical boxes on the house. Can you even believe that the people in this house have electricity and, you know, a washing machine? It seems so medieval, doesn't it? But he's left all the modern stuff out. So that's on purpose. It's accurate, but anti-modern. But, you know, as I looked at the photograph, I thought, okay, if I was Andy Wyeth and it's January and it's freezing and I'm standing out there by the highway, I'm probably going to lean up against that telephone pole to do the drawings. And I thought, okay, wait a minute. So look at the photograph. If the painter is standing by the telephone pole, I should be able to flip the photograph and see what he was seeing. You see what I mean? If I flip the photograph, I'm kind of getting the view back in the other direction. And so this is what happens when you flip the photograph and you line it up to the tree in the painting. The tree in the photograph and the tree in the painting are identical. Totally identical. Now remember, he never worked from photographs. He didn't like photography. He hated cameras. He thought cameras destroyed creativity. So he's drawing. His drawing is the tree. Absolute accuracy. This is not like anybody else. He is enigmatic. Now, I think you know he's not like the abstract expressionists who were so popular in the 1950s. We know that. In fact, every book about Andrew Wyeth emphasizes the abstract expressionists hated him. He's not an abstract expressionist. He's out of step. We know that. He is not Franz Klein. These two paintings, both 1959. But the question I ask in this book that I think has never been asked is, what do representational painters think about Andrew Wyeth? You know, the painters who are trying to paint reality, what do they think about Andrew Wyeth? And the bombshell to me is they don't understand him either. The representational painters don't understand. And I spent a long time in the book comparing him like to Corot in the 19th century or Fairfield Porter in the 20th century. Look at these paintings. These are representational paintings, but they're not absolute accuracy. No one would think, you know, that tree in Corot exists somewhere. It's imagination. That's not what Andrew Wyeth's art is. It's absolute. And many have to say representational painters of the 20th century expressed dislike for Andrew Wyeth's art, including Fairfield Porter. I compare him to Graham Sutherland in England. Graham Sutherland, about the same generation as Andrew Wyeth, he loved nature too. Both of these men, they went out sketching. That was their approach, wander the hills, sketching. But the difference with Graham Sutherland is that the sketch comes back to the studio and is redrawn and redrawn again and again and again. And Graham Sutherland talks about the metamorphosis that the sketch undergoes, so that the sketch changes and the final painting looks very different from nature itself. That's a rather typical 20th century approach to nature. That's not Andrew Wyeth's approach at all. Nature is the sketch is the painting. It's different. You see this in the orchard at Chad's Ford. When he paints the orchard, it's accurate, it's spot on. That tree is a real tree. The trees in the background are real trees where they really are in life. This is his approach. He loves that orchard. Helga said the orchard is Andy's soul. It was in the orchard, and it's right behind his parents' house, that Andrew Wyeth was taught to paint by his father, N.C. Wyeth. N.C. Wyeth planted the orchard trees. Remember, he's from Massachusetts. He loved the orchard. He loved the apples. There's N.C. gathering his fruit in the fall. And I think it's critical that it's in the orchard that these Helga pictures really come alive. Andrew Wyeth paints Helga again and again and again in the orchard. And she blends with the trees. She becomes one with nature. The light that falls across her face is the same light that describes the rough trunks of the orchard apple trees. I think this is key if we're going to understand this Helga relationship. She becomes nature to Andy Wyeth. He's worshiped nature all his life. Finally, here he meets a woman who embodies for him the spirit of nature itself. Helga is nature. And in the orchard, she merges with the natural world that he's worshiped forever. In fact, he even portrays Helga as Flora, the goddess of nature. So those enigmatic Helga pictures that people have struggled to understand, I think a real key to these paintings is that Helga becomes, in his mind, this fleet-footed child of the woods who takes him out of civilization, who steals him away and pulls him back into nature, into the hills and the cornfields where he played as a little boy. She takes him back into that childhood world, and the two of them together immerse themselves in nature. Well, thank you all very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have.
Oh, thank you so much, Barksdale, for that I think kind of riveting and interesting and detailed presentation. I'm deeply grateful on behalf of all of us here. At this time, I'm adjusting the view here so we can see everybody. Are there any questions for Barksdale? If you have some, you can put them either in the chat or you can simply raise your hand right now and I'll call on you just so to kind of make it a little more orderly. I see Jerry right away. So Jerry, go ahead, and just so you know, you are muted. Everybody is muted. So when you go to speak, just make sure to unmute yourself. Go ahead, Jerry.
Got it. I'm just curious. Can you hear me?
Yep, thanks, Jerry.
I'm just curious whether you encountered Redifer in your discussions or his family in the area.
I did. I talk in the book about the fact that Andrew Wyeth, he never had art students. He never taught a group of students, but there were people who moved from across the country to be near Andrew Wyeth. And so there's a coterie of artists that kind of loosely forms around Andrew Wyeth. And one of these was Redifer. Redifer was one of the few people that Andrew Wyeth would allow to tag along, and they would go painting together. Extremely, extremely rare. Redifer saw Andrew Wyeth get frustrated with a watercolor painting on the banks of the Brandywine. And Andrew Wyeth said, "Darn this painting." And he scooped up some mud off the riverbank and he smeared it across the painting to try to help out the picture. What a great anecdote that is. Sadly, though, Mr. Redifer has passed away. And in fact, I think all of the artists in the coterie of Andrew Wyeth have passed away. You know, sometimes I think I wish I had written this book 10 or 15 years earlier and could have captured some of those voices.
Thank you. Bill.
Just a couple of observations. The picture that you just showed of Helga with the garland.
Yeah.
If you look at Botticelli's painting, The Spring, there's a woman with a garland that looks remarkably like that picture of Helga with the garland. And the only other observation I had is one of the very first pictures you showed, the one of the trough full of water.
Yeah.
When I saw that at the Philadelphia Museum of Art during that show, however many years ago it was, the first thing I thought of was the death of Marat. The David painting, the bucket. I mean, it's like a mirror image. The bucket would be the head. There's a tub. There's a board over the tub. There's even like where there was an inkwell. There's some little cup on the tub. It was just extraordinary.
Look at that. That's a good suggestion.
That was amazing.
You know, as an art historian, I I've tracked down a lot of these leads. I always think that I'm going to find the clue, the key to the painting, but usually I'm foiled in this attempt. And Andrew Wyeth himself, he was once asked by a journalist, who do you feel closest to among the old masters? And he said none of them. So he didn't help the art historian out very much.
Thanks,
He said,
Bill.
he said, quote, I don't feel particularly close to any of them. Any other questions?
Yeah. We have a question here in the chat that came through. How do you account for the wide popularity of Wyeth's paintings, so different from the other 20th century paintings that you so elaborately described?
That's an excellent question. I think that's the question that somebody really needs to write a book about, is his fame. How did he become famous? What made him famous? What was it that makes him appealing to the general public when so many other artists weren't appealing? I mean, certainly that's part of it. You know, if you didn't like abstract expressionism, then he was kind of your default person. But I speculate a lot about this. If you look at people who collected Wyeth art or expressed a powerful interest in Wyeth, for example, President Eisenhower. President Eisenhower was just obsessed with Andrew Wyeth's paintings. President Eisenhower had Andrew Wyeth come to the White House to give him painting lessons. But if you look at Eisenhower, like so many of that generation, he'd grown up on a farm, he'd lived that rural life, and then he'd seen that whole world vanish. And everything gets buried under highways and factories and subdivisions. I think that's a major part of Andrew Wyeth's appeal. It was to the generation I call my grandparents' generation, that were rural farm children, and then that was taken away from them by progress. But to them, Andrew Wyeth represents what they had lost, and there's a deep, profound nostalgia for them. I would add too, this is a sad postscript, but I have yet to find anybody under the age of 40 who's ever heard of Andrew Wyeth. Isn't that remarkable? His reputation seems to have evaporated among young people.
That is, as someone who's the only one under 40 here in this group right now, I will say I heard of Andrew Wyeth only after I came to Bryn Mawr, and a member took me to the Brandywine River Museum, and that was my introduction to Andrew Wyeth. But I had never encountered him prior to that. So it's been being in this area, in that region. A question here that came through, a person wrote, it sounds like you interviewed Helga. Can you talk about her personality, how she reacted to questions, etc.?
No, did not interview Helga. Helga was very, very reticent for many, many years. She loved Andrew Wyeth, was very protective, is very protective of Andrew Wyeth. I think she's a real interpreter of Andrew Wyeth. In other words, she understands his work. She understands his work. She was with him. She watched him paint. He explained to her what he was doing, so she can interpret what it's all about. She gave an interview after Andy died, in which she was much more candid about what their relationship had meant to her and to him. So, but I did not have the opportunity to interview her.
Thank you. We have time for about one more question. I'll go. I see Jerry, your hand up. So Jerry, you have the final question.
Oh gosh, I don't want to have the final question, but maybe it's a good one. I wondered if our presenter has any interest in similar follow-up in these same details in Maine, or is that already been well researched?
That's a good question. I shopped this book around to different publishers, and one of them said, "Oh, this book is great. Now make it twice as long and do Maine." And I thought, I got little kids. I can't go up to Maine. So as a practical matter, I will never understand the Maine world. I mean, I've seen it, but I would never understand it to the depth, I think, as I do the Chadds Ford world. I've lived here in this area since 1992. So, and I don't, believe me, I don't understand all of it myself, but I think someone needs to do Maine, but I think someone needs to do it from the Maine perspective with the depth of knowledge that you get by really living there.
Mm. Mm. Thank you, Barksdale. This has been absolutely wonderful. I guess I had a kind of a false lead. I have one last question, but it's for you. If someone wants to learn more about your work or learn about if there's online presentations or your books, where would you direct them?
Well, if you go on Amazon, my books are on Amazon. If you want to write to me personally, it's barksdalemaynard@gmail.com. And I would be happy to point you to various directions.
Great. Thank you. I will put that in the chat here, and I'm going to turn it back to Suzanne to offer a final word of thanks. And Suzanne, just so you know, you are muted.
Oh, my goodness, what could I say? Barksdale, that was absolutely wonderful.
Oh, thank you, Suzanne.
Just to hear those stories and see those paintings and explain to us. It was just lovely. And we just appreciate you so much. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge.
Thanks to all of you. God bless you.
Thank you too.
Thank you.
Thanks.